Well, thanks everybody for coming along. I'm the guy with the funny accent. I hope you're having a good time. And before I get to the thrust of the lecture itself, I thought I'd just sort of say a few things about Scott's lecture in relation to sort of the weirder side of Bigfoot. And I think, like a lot of people who get interested in the Bigfoot phenomenon, they, like me, you begin to think, well, you know, there really are large ape-like animals running around the United States, Russia, China, and a number of other nations where you get reports of Bigfoot. But over time, I found that Bigfoot isn't just strange, Bigfoot is sort of really strange. And when, for example, Scott was talking about sort of the telepathic angle of this and the orbs, that's something you find in a lot of places around the United States and elsewhere as well. So whatever Bigfoot actually is, I do believe these creatures exist, but I don't believe they're just sort of a North American equivalent of an African gorilla. I think it's far stranger than that, particularly when you look into the stories where you have reports of, for example, Bigfoot quite literally vanishing in a flash of light in front of people's eyes, which, of course, no regular, normal animal has the ability to do that. And I think the other sort of most glaring aspect is the fact that we've never caught one. We've never got the body of a creature. Now, if you think about it, the reports, as Scott said, there are reports of Bigfoot all across the United States, in every state. And these creatures sort of range from 7 to 8 feet tall. And we're still not able to catch them. Now, if Bigfoot, the creatures themselves, were just sort of the size of, I don't know, a squirrel or a fox, I could understand how we would never actually sort of catch one of these things. But in saying that, I think when we're talking about something, a giant creature, then we really should have at least one body by now. And again, I think that sort of demonstrates that Bigfoot isn't just elusive, but it's sort of really elusive. Now, how we explain this, I don't know. Certainly on the fringe side of Bigfoot research, there's a belief system that these creatures are sort of multi-dimensional, if you like, that we only see them when perhaps they're in our reality. Now, things like quantum physics, for example, are allowing for the existence of multiple dimensions within our reality and outside of it. So, although that's, I would say, even I have to admit, that's a very sort of extreme aspect, but I find it very, very difficult to try and explain the phenomenon away in any other sort of fashion that we could do it. And by that, I mean, as I said, we should have found one of these things by now. We should have either found a dead one, someone killed one crossed the road and got hit by a car, but it never ever happens. And no other animal operates or exists like that. Now, most people don't ever see, a mountain lion or a grizzly bear in the woods, but people do. And sometimes grizzly bears and mountain lions do get hit by cars or trucks. Why is it that Bigfoot eludes all of these scenarios concerning how they might die? Bigfoot eludes these scenarios 100% of the time. And I just don't see how a normal animal, even if it's a rare one, I don't see how a rare animal could actually exist like that and never ever be found. So there's a big issue to be dealt with, and if we do find the truth about these Bigfoot creatures, whatever they might be, I think it's going to have a greater bearing on what cryptozoology actually is. Now, cryptozoology is the study of unknown animals, sort of the chupacabra, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, the Yeti, and so on. But if it's shown that the Bigfoot creatures are some sort of supernatural type creature rather than just a North American ape, then I think it's going to have a lot of impact upon cryptozoology itself, in the sense that, are we dealing with flesh and blood animals? Should cryptozoology embrace the supernatural and the paranormal? Now, a lot of long-time researchers in the field of cryptozoology would say, well, all these creatures, all these animals, all these unknown monsters are just flesh and blood things that we haven't found. I think that, for me at least, is really at the far end of the equation. I think we're dealing with something much stranger. And as I said, I think for cryptozoology and so-called monster hunters, I think if we do get the answers, it's going to challenge science and not just zoology. And we may learn a great deal more if we do find a Bigfoot one day, whether alive or dead, if these things can sort of jump multiple dimensions and things like that. So that's just sort of my thoughts and ideas and a few concepts on what Bigfoot might be. And the reason I mention that is because there's also sort of a tie-in with UFOs, which I'm going to talk about today. And I think, again, when you have reports of strange lights in the sky, lights beaming down to the ground, and in the same area and the same time frame that people see the Bigfoot creatures, I think we're seeing some sort of connection with UFOs as well. Now, I don't kind of go down the path that, Bigfoot literally flies a flying saucer. That would be just way too bizarre. I don't think it's that simple. But when you have these strange lights in the sky that Scott talked about, these balls of light, these energy balls, however you want to term them, they're a rare aspect of Bigfoot research, but there are enough reports to demonstrate that there is this aspect to it. And again, we don't know what the phenomenon actually is. Now, people like John Keel, for example, who wrote the Mothman Prophecies, John Keel started off, like me and a lot of other people, thought all of these different phenomena, Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, etc., were all separate phenomena. But he came to believe over time that they were all kind of interconnected, and I think that is the case. When you get Bigfoot, you get UFOs, you have strange lights, all in that same area. I think we have to sort of start looking at the issue of these creatures, and many of these other creatures as well, all being part and parcel of one phenomenon. So that's my little bit on Bigfoot. And I think, like I said, if we do get the answers, then it's going to change and challenge just about every aspect of science and zoology. Now, that brings us to today's lecture, From Area 51 to Russia. What I'm going to do for you today is sort of give you a background on Area 51, the base itself, the history of it, how it began, why it began, and also, of course, the UFO issue, which is the one that most people associate with Area 51. And, of course, the big questions are, to what extent is Area 51 sort of a holding place for alien technology, possibly even live and dead aliens at Area 51? These are some of the more controversial statements and claims that have been made. And so what I've tried to do over the years, I've dug quite deeply into the whole story of Area 51 and tried to determine the truth from the lies to the exaggerations and the disinformation which is put out also to try and confuse what we know about it or what we don't know about it. But just before I get to that, just sort of give you some idea as to why and how I got interested in sort of the more of the conspiratorial side of UFO research. Because it actually goes back to the 1950s, and my father, I should stress, I'm one of these people who's actually never seen a UFO or had an alien encounter. I'm someone who's had an experience by being told of an encounter. And I think people do tend to fall into two categories when they have or they develop an interest in UFOs. You either see something or you know someone who you trust saw something amazing, and that gets you involved. And certainly for me, it was the second category. My dad was a radar mechanic in the British Royal Air Force, which is the equivalent of the US Air Force over here. And he was involved in 3 UFO incidents at the height of a NATO exercise in September 1952. And that operation was called Exercise Mainbrace. And it involved military personnel from the US, from the UK, from Norway, France. And it was really sort of a stand-up to the Russians to say, you know, if you think you can take us on, well, try. And so Exercise Mainbrace was created as like a show of force to the Russians, but it was also put together to show how all the Western allies could get together in the event of a Third World War, which thankfully hasn't happened yet. But my father was involved in 3 late-night encounters where radar operators at the military base he was working at on the east coast of England, he was on duty, and this was sort of 2, 3 a.m., and the radar operators were tracking these high-flying, fast-moving objects in the sky. And the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians. This was, as I said, this was 1952. The Cold War was really taking off. And so fighter planes were scrambled from a nearby Air Force base. And as the pilots got closer, they were able to see not like bombers or fighter planes, but these large balls of light. And some of the other pilots reported seeing sort of classic silvery flying saucers. And quite naturally, the pilots were ordered to intercept them. Well, that didn't work. What actually happened was that these objects shot away at an incredible speed, and eventually the pilots had to return to their bases because they were running low on fuel, because these objects were playing almost like a game of cat and mouse with the pilots. Now, this went on for 3 nights, and at the end of the 3rd night, everybody was taken into a room and told, you won't talk about this, and everybody was reminded that they'd signed what was called the Official Secrets Act. And in the UK, the Official Secrets Act, it's a sort of piece of legislation where if you learn top secret material in the course of your work with the military or the intelligence community, you won't talk about it after you've retired. Now, my dad didn't actually say anything about this till I was about probably 12 or 13, something like that. And that really got me interested, and I started reading books on the subject and watching movies, that kind of thing. But I did sort of move more towards like the conspiracy stuff, like Area 51, probably because of my own father's experience and how his team were told not to talk about this. And I always think that if governments don't want us to talk about something, or they don't want us to know about it, it usually is something we should know about, So, I think that's an important angle to make. Now, of course, when it comes to UFOs, there are numerous aspects to the subject. You've got alien abductions, contact cases, crop circles, lights in the sky, crashed UFOs, dead aliens held at military bases, and so on. But there's no doubt that Area 51 and the story of it really stands out in the sense that, in a way that other aspects of the subject really don't. And by that, I mean, if you mention a specific UFO case to the average person, they'll just say, huh? Don't know what that means. But you mention Area 51, just about everybody on the planet has heard of Area 51. And in a strange way, Area 51 is the most secret military facility on the planet, but everybody's heard of it, which is sort of like a really weird situation. And the primary main reason as to why Area 51 has become so notorious is because of that incredible secrecy that surrounds it. It's just one of these situations where you do not find that in any other situation. If you look at just about every other military facility in the United States, of course they're all heavily guarded, but none of that guarding situation comes anywhere near what goes on at Area 51. And I'll give you some background as we go along as to how and why it's proved to be impossible to sort of access Area 51 unless you actually work there. And of course, when you've got this angle of so much secrecy and security, the big question is, well, why does that secrecy and security even exist in the first place? Why is it that the base itself is not just guarded in the exact same way that just about all the other military bases are? And so it sort of begs the question, well, what's going on there? And that sort of brings us to the issue of what has made Area 51 so famous or infamous, and that's the UFO connection. Now, although the work to begin the creation of Area 51 didn't begin until the 1950s, the idea of actually building sort of a large series of facilities out in Nevada, far away from just about anyone and everyone, actually goes back to 1941. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that the origins or the plans to create something like an Area 51 actually goes back to Pearl Harbor, the attack of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And that's an actual photograph of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, prior to 9/11, Pearl Harbor was the worst attack on the United States. Literally thousands of people were killed in this sort of terrible attack from Japanese forces. And the reason why the attack happened and the reason why so many people were killed was because the Japanese fleet and the Japanese aircraft were actually able to sort of fly really low across the Pacific and create a surprise attack. That was the problem, that the surprise angle of it all is what led to sort of the disastrous and terrible killings that occurred. And after Pearl Harbor, the government basically said we can never allow something like that to happen again. We can never have someone sort of surprise us in such a terrible way. And so plans were put together to create specifically strategic military bases further inside the country. In other words, if we had these facilities created in like Nevada, New Mexico and so on, if somebody outside of the country tried to attack, we would have plenty of time to track them coming inward into the country. So that was the idea, was to sort of build some of the more strategic bases far as possible inside the country. And also they needed to be areas where nobody really would be able to access them and nobody would really know what was going on there. So by about 1943, 1944, out at where Area 51 is now, there were actually a number of facilities created, like gunneries and artillery ranges, things like that. But it was never, at that time, sort of all consolidated into one particular base. That actually didn't happen until the early 1950s, when the government really decided to get down and say, well, why don't we put all of these different facilities, these bases together? And that's basically what happened. Now, Area 51, that's an aerial photograph of Area 51 taken by a spy satellite. And there aren't that many images of Area 51. There's enough for us to make a good image of what the place looks like, but as you can see there's a number of facilities, runways, and things like that. And for the most part, that is pretty much all we can see at Area 51. Now, it's called Area 51 because it's actually just one of many areas on what's called the Nevada Test and Training Range. And the training range itself is gigantic. It's even bigger than Area 51. Area 51 is just a small portion. And the plan was to have this isolated, well-guarded military installation, which could be essentially the hub of all the high-tech research that the government wanted to do and which it wanted to keep the Russians away from. And so, in that sense, by around about 1950, 51, the concept and the idea of creating something like Area 51 really started to begin. Now, excuse me, when we get to the whole angle of Area 51 and what might be going on there, you'll sort of realize that it's very much like mirrors within mirrors. One person thinks this, one person says that. So it's very kind of difficult to figure out where the truth begins and the disinformation begins. But just before I get to that, purely coincidentally, I'm sure many of you might know that just recently this petition was put together to sort of basically storm Area 51 and see what actually goes out there. Have any of you heard of that particular petition? Yeah, well, that's good. The petition, I mean, it's a very controversial situation, and I actually don't endorse it at all. The main reason being, if you think about it, I think a lot of people who signed this petition and who've said, just a couple of months from now that they're going to go out with thousands of other people and storm Area 51 and try and find the aliens and so on. The way I look at it is like this, that if you are going to do something along those lines, you should realize that you're actually breaking into a US military base. Now, I'm sure most of us live within, say, 30, 40 miles of a military installation. Now, if you think about it, if you got up tomorrow morning and you saw on the news that 200 people had tried to storm your local military base, most people would be appalled by that. It would be perceived as a major national security issue if several hundred people had climbed the fence at your local base, causing havoc. But I think with the Area 51 angle, I think a lot of people are viewing this as just as an adventure. This is going to be cool. We're going to break into Area 51. But, of course, you have the possibility some of those people may not be UFO researchers. That they could be North Korea, they could be Russians. We don't know. Infiltrating that group. And, of course, anyone who sort of tries to jump the base at a military facility, you're asking for trouble. And if people do, if they go on this, sign this petition and they go on that expedition out there, they're asking for, the biggest trouble possible. So personally, there's different views and different ideas, but personally, I don't endorse this at all. I think it's dangerous to, literally have thousands of people breaking into a US military base. And I think it's wrong to condone the idea of breaking into a military base as well. So, you have different people have different views. I think we can do good enough research to find out what's going on out at the base and what has been going on there without actually causing chaos and literally invading a military installation, which, as I said, no one should really be doing at all. So that's sort of my little piece on this petition and the plans. Now, it'll be interesting to see what actually happens, if anything happens. My personal view is I think a lot of people may go out there and just hang out and then go home. I really don't think you're going to find American citizens in their thousands trying to break in to a well-guarded military installation. I mean, under any other circumstances, people would be arrested already, probably, by actually saying we're planning to do this. I mean, it's kind of like, if you imagine somebody says we're going to sign a petition to jump the fence and invade the Pentagon. Well, those people would probably already by now, be in custody or at least being questioned. And I think people aren't necessarily realizing the gravity of what they're letting themselves into. So either it's going to be something memorable, but for all the wrong reasons, or the whole thing's going to be shut down before it can begin. Or maybe people, will just sort of kind of walk away from it feeling, well, maybe I shouldn't do it after all. So, but it's not that far away now, so, we're going to find out what actually will happen. Now, one of the primary reasons why it's so difficult to access Area 51 is because you've got that kind of view. There isn't really much to see other than mountains, and climbing those mountains, is very difficult for a lot of people. Bear in mind, the temperatures out in Nevada as well. And in that photograph, you can probably see a few small buildings and structures, and that really is all that you can actually see for the most part. Now, the reason why Area 51 was sort of built in this particular part of Nevada, surrounded by mountains, was primarily because of this angle with, with Pearl Harbor, and wanting to build something in the middle of nowhere, which could be very difficult to access. And on top of that, over the years, the government has secured various, more and more land in the area, again, to keep people away. And a lot of that land that's being grabbed by the government actually isn't land that has become part of Area 51. It's just sort of illegal to actually go on those parts of the land, primarily because you go too close to it, then you can actually see parts of the base. But by grabbing that land and making it out of bounds, that has ensured it's very difficult to see Area 51 at all. Now, as far as the history goes, what we know for certain is, and I'll come to this to a larger degree later, the primary purpose for building Area 51 was to test fly some of the new early radical aircraft that the government was planning on creating and flying in the early to mid-1950s. And they didn't want anyone to know what was going on, didn't want anybody, taking photographs of these aircraft. So that's why they didn't go with, say, for example, California or New York to test these aircraft, simply because they would easily be seen. So the angle was, well, let's try and build it out of the way, somewhere that's already out of the way, and let's make it even more difficult for people to find out what we're doing there. Now, it's sort of incredible that with Area 51, we have a situation where, although it's impossible to access it, just about, and We don't really know what's going on there. The fact is, it's actually less than 100 miles away from Las Vegas. People sometimes get this image that it's really deep into the desert in the middle of nowhere, but it actually isn't. I mean, you put your foot down on the accelerator from Las Vegas, you can be there in just over an hour. So that the distance from civilization, so to speak, is not very far. The big problem, however, is that Area 51 is extremely well guarded, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, to the point where nothing else is like it. They have night vision equipment, helicopters flying around 24/7, drones flying around 24/7. They've got ground detector equipment, which, for example, if a person walks across the desert towards Area 51 at night, or let's say a fox or an armadillo walks across the desert, the technology actually allows them to determine if it's a person or if it's a small animal. And night vision, infrared technology. So the chances of actually penetrating Area 51 are very, very small. Now, a lot of people get confused when they've gone out to the base, or as close as they can, and they say they've been turned away from the base where the guards are. That's actually not the case. People get very mixed up with the sort of area, the small areas where there are guards. People assume that that is the fringes of Area 51. It actually isn't. These are just sort of small buildings which are the first level of what happens if you try and get out there. The first thing that happens, you'll see the security guards pull up in their vehicles and probably stay like about 100 yards away and just watch you. And then if you try and get a little bit closer, then they can detain you or stop you, and they can fine you and jail you for being on government property. But people assume that those sort of little buildings where the security guards are, that actually is not the perimeter of Area 51, like a lot of people think. When you reach the security personnel, even if you got past that, you still have to go about another 8 or 9 miles across rugged desert land. So that's another reason why it's proven to be so difficult to get to the base, because they're constantly on guard, constantly patrolling the area on the ground and on the skies as well. And so, as far as I know, no one has ever got beyond the first stage of security personnel, the ones who will turn you back or arrest you or just make your life hell for the next 72 hours, which quite literally they have the ability and the law to do that. Now, I've titled that one Declassified by Mistake because that's a government map of Area 51 and the area itself. And you can see on the right, you've got this huge, long runway, various buildings, and so on. So it hasn't, that actual image there, that map, that goes back decades. And although the surface area still pretty much looks like that today, you can see how it began and how it developed to what we know it to be today. But that particular map is important because, as you can see, it's actually titled Area 51. And now, for the most part, the government has always been very reticent to refer to it as Area 51. Even the name was classified for decades, and actually still is, but the fact is everybody knows about it. But that map's important because it was one of the first pieces of official documentation that came into the public domain that mentioned Area 51 by name. And as I said, it actually declassified under the Freedom of Information Act by mistake. And that does sometimes happen where people use the Freedom of Information Act to try and get hold of documents. What it demonstrates is that with Area 51 and the Freedom of Information Act, sometimes material documentation has surfaced and has been declassified by mistake. Now, it doesn't happen that often, but it has happened on enough times to where we do have a few documents that mention the base by name. Now, before we get to the UFO angle, which of course is the one that everybody wants to hear about and likes, it's worth noting that before the UFO issue started to surface, what we had before that was the testing, the secret testing of classified aircraft. And that was an aircraft called the A-12. And as you can see, that sort of futuristic looking thing, that aircraft goes back decades, literally decades. And you can also see the desert there and the surrounding mountains. Now, back then, they certainly did have the highly sophisticated surveillance, so it was primarily guards that were just sort of on rotation 24/7, trying to keep people away. But the A-12, it looks like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. And certainly if you'd seen that flying in the 1960s over Nevada and it was seen outside of the confines of the mountains, you might actually thought you'd seen some sort of weird alien space rockets. So, we do sort of need to differentiate and determine, what kind of UFOs might be ours or the government's, what kind of UFOs might be something from up there. And I think that's one of the areas that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate, is that there could well be our UFOs and something else's UFOs as well. Now, that's another one, or I should say two, the M21 and the D21. Now, the M21, again, this sort of sleek black aircraft, that's the M21, and there, on top of it, you've got the D21, which is sort of a smaller aircraft we can detach from the main one. And again, it sort of demonstrates some of the weird stuff that was going on out there. That's a really weird one. That's called the Have Blue. Some people think that's just like a model or a mock-up. It actually isn't. The Have Blue, as far as we know, was never really used to any great degree, but it was certainly test flown. And I guess more than any of the strange aircraft that were tested out at Area 51, the Have Blue, which was its code name, was a really, really strange and futuristic one. It kind of looks like something you would see in like a Star Wars movie, but it was very much like a stealth type aircraft, and it had that strange shape to sort of deflect radar like the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber do today. Now we come to sort of the crux of the story of Area 51 and how it became so famous and infamous. And it all revolves around this guy, Bob Lazar. Now, as I'm sure everybody's heard of Bob Lazar, or most people, yeah. Well, for people who don't know, Bob Lazar is someone who, in 1988, he came out of the shadows, so to speak, and claimed that he'd been working out of a subsidiary at Area 51 called S4. And he said that out at S4 there were a number of recovered or donated, however you want to term it, UFOs, alien spacecraft, out at S4, and that the government had a small team that was investigating the technology and trying to duplicate the technology. And it really opened the doors to the world of Area 51. And I think regardless of what you think of Lazar and his story, the fact is that had Lazar not come onto the scene, we probably would not have heard of Area 51 to any great degree. For example, if you look into even the military aircraft magazines of that era in the 80s, there wasn't too much said about Area 51. Certainly nobody in the public, for the most part, had ever heard of it. And the only people who really bothered about it were the people who lived near in Nevada who lived relatively close to the base and knew about it for years. But certainly, when Bob Lazar came out to tell his story, that is when people not just made a connection between Area 51 and UFOs, but when the term Area 51 became known. And in that sense, you know, it really did develop right from there. It went from sort of zero to sort of vertical in terms of interest. Now, to understand Lazar's story, we have to sort of go back to 1988. Lazar himself was, or still is, I should say, he's a brilliant scientist, very, by his own admission, sort of a maverick type character who sort of thinks outside of the box and things like that. And he said that in the latter part of 1988, he was offered a job out at S4, this subsidiary kind of base at Area 51. And at the time the job offer came forward, Lazar said that they were very cagey in the interview. You know, would you be interested in this program? Because Lazar was a physicist, so he had an interesting background, and he was very, you know, adept in the world of science. And he was approached, interviewed. He said during the interview, not too much was said. It was very kind of cagey. Would you like to work on this program with advanced technologies? You might find something really interesting. Now, looking into Lazar's background, we find some good things and a couple of red flags. For example, with Lazar's background, we haven't been able to fully confirm all of his educational backgrounds that he's claimed to have had. So that people are still looking into that, and they've been looking into that for a long, long time. But we do know that he did work at this particular place, which is the Los Alamos laboratories in New Mexico. Now, the Los Alamos labs, their work goes back to the Second World War and the developments of the atomic bomb. So, in that sense, just like Area 51, the Los Alamos labs are highly classified and well guarded. And when he was working there, and one particular day in 1982, Lazar was mentioned on a front page of one of the local newspapers. Now, this is important because everything we know about Lazar and UFOs surfaced in 1988 and 1989 onwards. But Lazar himself was actually in the public domain to a small degree in 1982, when, as I said, he was mentioned in this front page article in one of the local newspapers. At the time, Lazar was very much into like rocket cars and things like this, and him and his friends would go out into the desert and literally sort of light up their cars and zoom across the desert at 200 miles an hour. That's how he was a guy who sort of really enjoyed, just sort of soaring across the desert floor in these rocket cars, which they converted from regular cars. Now, it turns out that this particular article in the newspaper heavily covered Lazar's background and his interest and in alternative technologies, if you like. And from there, it turns out that this man on the right, that's President Reagan there, that man is Edward Teller, who was one of the leading scientists within the US government and the defense industry from the 1940s right till his death, I think in 2003 or thereabouts. And Teller actually read the article that mentioned Lazar, and the two of them met when Lazar was giving a lecture, and they had a chat for a while, and it was several years after that that Lazar was approached to work on this program at S4. And if you look at the timeline, it's almost certainly the case that the meeting he had, or the interview and chat he had with Edward Teller, almost certainly, probably, led to someone deciding to contact Lazar and probably try and get him onto the program. And I said maybe and probably because we don't really know the full timeline of what happened. But I don't think, had Lazar not met Edward Teller, I doubt he probably wouldn't have been put forward for the program. Now, before we sort of jump too far forward, one thing I have to sort of note is that when Lazar's story came out and he talked about how he'd met Teller and so on, well, one of the local news teams actually tracked down Teller and managed to speak to him and said, what do you think about this guy, Bob Lazar? He's talking about you and, you know, in relation to this interview and so on. And what happened was that Teller responded in a really weird way. Now, if, say, for example, someone was talking about any of us in the room and it was untrue, but you were talking about it on the news, on media, and so on, you might be inclined to take legal action. Teller didn't do anything like that. What he actually did when he was approached by a TV news team, he sort of fumbled and didn't really know what to say. He kind of said words like this: well, I don't remember Bob Lazar. Maybe I met him, maybe I didn't, but if I did met him, I don't remember meeting him. It was almost like what you would call like lawyer speak, you know, as if he'd been coached to say something, but not to say too much. And again, it's very weird that one of the most primary powerful figures in the scientific community in the US government would not confirm, and more importantly, would not deny that he'd met Teller, that he'd met Lazar, and possibly had pushed things forward for Lazar to actually get this particular job, so to speak. So a lot of weird stuff surrounds Lazar, and which is why, for me, I keep sort of wide open on his claims. I don't believe personally that he is a hoaxer, but I'll get, as we go on, I'll get to what I think might be the thrust of it. But to go back to the interview, he had the interview and then he was contacted again and was told, look, this is going to be a highly classified program. You want to go out there, there's going to be severe penalties if you ever talk about this and so on. And Lazar actually didn't spend that much time out at Area 51, as a lot of people think. He first started working there in '88, he said, and by early '89, the job was over for reasons which will become clear. Now, according to Lazar, although it was from sort of, like I said, late '88 through early '89, so we're talking about several months, he didn't spend that entire time out at the base, and it was actually just a small time. So it could have been a total of perhaps several weeks, maybe a month or so altogether. But what we have is a situation where Lazar said he was taken out and taken to S4 and was basically then told, we want you to help working on an advanced technology propulsion system. He didn't really know what he was getting into at that particular time. He just assumed that the government had developed something radical and revolutionary and they wanted him on board, which for Lazar was, was exciting enough in itself. But when he was then shown something else, he realized that something bigger was going on. For example, the team out at S4 reportedly showed him a number of what we would call flying saucers held at S4. And what's interesting, he said that apart from one which had sort of a deep dent in the side of the craft, he said apart from that, the other vehicles, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, the others were intact. They seemed in sort of pristine shape. In other words, they weren't like as if they'd crashed, in like a Roswell scenario. He even speculated, could they have been donated? Were they found? He didn't have actually any answers to that. But when they allowed him to get inside one of these craft, Lazar said that everything inside was really small. He said the seats were only the size where you would get like a 4-year-old kid to sit in it. And when he noticed everything in there was sort of fitted out for really small people, that was when, if you like, the penny dropped, and he was thinking, wow, maybe these UFOs are not the government's UFOs after all, but they're somebody else's, and we've got them. We've got them, that they've become our property, so to speak. Then he realized from his perspective, oh my God, I'm working on a top secret alien technology program. And of course, by that time, he'd signed the contract, he was out there, and so in that sense, he was now forced to go ahead. There was no turning back. And Lazar worked there, he said, as I said, for a number of months. And one of the most interesting things he said was that, for the most part, hardly any developments or advancements had been made. He said over the years they brought in various scientists and experts to try and understand this propulsion system of the aliens, but reportedly they hadn't hardly got anywhere with it. It was just kind of a case of looking at the UFO and scratching your head and thinking, well, who else can we get in to look into this particular story? And how can we try and understand the technology? So in that way, to me, that sounds quite plausible. The idea that you could sort of have a UFO from another world and alien technology falling into your lap, the idea that within sort of 3 months, 6 months, you could replicate it and duplicate it and so on, that doesn't seem to me to be very plausible. But the idea that the best scientists on the planet would be baffled, to me, that does sound very plausible. And he said that the work was actually really slow going because they just did not know what to do with it or how to do anything with it. But nevertheless, they let him work on the program. But he made a big mistake, or from his perspective and with hindsight, because Lazar actually confided in a couple of friends as to what was going out there, and his ex-wife also knew as well. And so what happened from there is that Lazar, because he started to talk out of turn with his friends, he started to get worried. He wondered even if at one point, he might go out to the base and never be seen again, And so he decided that because he'd violated the contract and was now essentially a big problem to the government, he decided to go public. He felt if he was hiding behind the shadows, anything could happen to him. But if he actually went public to the media, then possibly he'd be okay, because nobody would touch him when his name was big news in the media and so on. So what happened is that he approached George Knapp, who's a well-respected journalist in Nevada, in Las Vegas, and George arranged to do a number of interviews with Lazar, basically telling the story which I'm just telling right now. And at the time, Lazar had his name just under an alias, and so nobody really knew who he was. But just a few months after that, Lazar became more comfortable and started to talk about what was going on out at S4 and how he'd seen these UFO-type craft, and they didn't seem to be the kind of things that a 6-foot US test pilot could fly in. And like Lazar himself, George Knapp realized this was a huge story. Now, of course, the big question is, were these flying saucers, these UFOs, ours or somebody else's? That's the big question. Now, that's an artist's impression of a 1950s UFO that the US military developed called the Avro car. And that's sort of a fairly accurate image of what it looked like. You got the US emblem on, flying saucer, and the one bit that isn't real, you've got like this cannon coming out of the top of the flying saucer. But that was made like that to demonstrate that the government was thinking of making circular aircraft that could be essentially a weapon of war. Now that's a real picture of the Avro car. It kind of looks impressive, but the fact is it barely got off the ground. And when I say barely got off the ground, I mean like 3 to 4 feet. And they were able to fly it sort of in the air, as I said, about a height of 3 or 4 feet for maybe a few hundred yards, and it would sometimes clang on the ground and so on. And it really didn't work too well. That's another one. As you can see, you've got the US Air Force emblems there. Now, of course, this is going back to the 50s, so we're talking 60 years ago. Now, is it possible that in that intervening 60 years since that was created to now, or even 30 years after, which would have been 1988, 89, when Lazar surfaced, it's not impossible that we could have developed something like that, much better than the Avro car, and that was in use in 1988. And maybe Lazar saw something that wasn't a real UFO, but was something that was actually alien technology. Excuse me, it wasn't alien technology, but which was actually something of the government. But, of course, the big question is, why on earth would the government create something like that with tiny seats? You know, that just doesn't make much sense. That's actually one of the Avro cars that you can see in a museum. I think it's the Wright-Patterson Museum, and you can see it's a bit battered and messed up, and but you can still see the basic shape of it. That's another one, Project Y. Again, sort of like a flying saucer type craft, and again, there was nothing particularly spectacular about any of these craft at all. In the sense that they look weird. That was about it. There was no radical advanced technology, but they did kind of look and resemble flying saucers as they were perceived back in the 1950s. And so in that sense, I think we can certainly make a case, I think, that if we're flying things like that and that, even just sort of to a small degree in the 1950s, I don't think it's impossible at all that we might have something like along those lines today. Now, the story gets really weird when Lazar said that as well as giving him access to the alien technology to try and understand the propulsion system, they also, he said, gave him this huge amount of highly classified government material to read, which basically told the story of the human-alien interaction that had gone on for thousands of years, and maybe even longer. And these files talked about how the aliens supposedly had genetically manipulated early primitive people, possibly millions of years ago, and sort of made periodical upgrades, which is the actual wording he said was in the documents, periodic upgrading of primitive humans to where we are today. And also, though, in the files, there was a very strange section, almost like a sinister aspect to the story, where Lazar read one particular part of the documents that said that the aliens viewed us as what they called containers. And Lazar wondered, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean by containers? And the more the delving that went into this, it appeared to be that the containers were us, were our physical bodies. But the aliens, for some reason, sinister reason, weird reason, had a deep interest or obsession in the human soul. And I say this gets sort of really weird but interesting. And the scenario was that the aliens didn't care at all, really, about us as physical flesh and blood and bone creatures, animals, people, however you want to term us. But it was this obsession with the human soul that they had. And over time, various other stories came out that the aliens themselves the scenario that actually the primary scenario that came out was that the so-called greys, these little creatures with the large black head, large head and the black eyes, the scenario is that they are not sort of living creatures like us, but they're sort of a biological robot created and sort of like a worker drone, that kind of thing. And that the fact that they don't have a normal life in the sense that we do, that they don't have souls. And so the theory is that the aliens had this obsession with the human soul as a means to try and determine if they could somehow almost like steal our souls and have infinite life themselves, which is a really controversial scenario. But that was basically the outgrowth that certain researchers believed when Lazar's story surfaced in relation to this angle of containers, and why from the aliens' perspective, it was very important that the containers were protected, and not because they particularly liked us or cared about us, but it was what was inside us that they actually had this obsession for. Now, if that is true, that would be very, very, very sinister. The idea, almost as if the Earth's like a farm, and they're farming our souls. That's one of the really controversial theories that you can find within certain aspects of UFO research. There's actually sort of an underground group, so to speak, who believe that that's exactly what's going on, that the Earth is sort of like a farm, and the farming is not physically of us, but of our souls. And that scenario actually went on and became a major part of alien abduction research. For example, Whitley Strieber, Dr. John Mack, various other well-respected abduction researchers and abductees also talked about that when they were abducted, on some occasions, they had sort of out-of-body experiences where, for example, they would see themselves looking down on their body with all these small creatures around the bed in a UFO, and yet they're looking down, kind of like a classic out-of-body experience that people have when they're in a situation in the hospital, they've had a heart attack, they briefly die for a few minutes, and when they come back, they have recollections of looking down at the doctors and the nurses frantically trying to get them to kickstart and come back to life again. And there are a lot of cases like that in the abduction field where people felt as if their soul had been ripped out of them, and that somehow the aliens were able to almost sort of absorb the soul as a means to try and achieve immortality, if of course the soul is immortal. So we had a situation where all of this began for Lazar with a study of alien technology, and then it leads into this really weird aspect of the human soul. Now, so I sometimes wonder if the real reason why the whole UFO subject is kept secret by the government, maybe not just because aliens are visiting us, not just because the technology, but maybe it's something else, something so strange, something like this, that the government is so fearful about telling us because they don't know how to tell us. And I think that's an important angle. The idea that, I think we often assume that not only do governments know what's going on, but they're also on top of things. They know what they're doing. But maybe they don't. Maybe they've uncovered something so shocking like this that they just don't know how to handle it, and so they bury it. with multiple disinformation stories and psychological warfare programs just to keep people away from this weirder story. Now, of course, this, for the most part, this part of the story comes from the files that Lazar was shown at Area 51. Of course, the big question is, well, how do we know the files that he saw were real? How do we know that that wasn't part of disinformation as well? Well, the answer is we actually don't really know. All we know for sure is that he was given that particular story, and that container's angle of the story really was the highlight for a while in terms of that particular aspect of his work out there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, unlike a lot of researchers, and particularly like the late Stan Friedman, Stan, I was good friends with Stan, and but we definitely we just differed on the whole scenario that Lazar was saying. Stan's actual words were bunk, bunk, bunk. He actually said that, and that was his sort of famous line whenever it came to talking about Lazar. Stan didn't believe any part of the story at all. Now, the reason why I don't believe that Lazar was a hoaxer was because occasionally, unfortunately, we do get people in the UFO field who want to fake things. It's just an unfortunate thing. It happens. And hopefully, if we can figure it out and show the hoax of who they are, well, that's a good thing. But as I said, we do get hoaxers now and again. But typically what they do, they'll claim they've had this experience, they get a book deal, they go on the lecture circuit, and they go on TV, and they do this for weeks and then months and then years, and then the story dries up. So what do? Well, they've got used to getting all this adoration and money and so on, so they add a new level to the story. Oh, I've had another experience, and so, I'm going to write another book, and so on and so on. That's typically what a lot of the hoaxers do. However, Lazar didn't do anything like that. For example, he gave his initial interviews to George Knapp in Las Vegas, as I mentioned. He did a few radio shows and a few lectures in the late 80s. And he never wrote a book about his experiences, never had a movie made, never went massively on the lecture circuit, and really didn't gain anything from actually coming out and telling this story. And that's not how your average hoaxer works. They hoax something in hope of getting something in return. Lazar wasn't even looking for anything in return. He was basically saying, well, this is the story I've got, take it or leave it. And again, whether you buy into his story or not, the story that he tells today is the same one he told 31 years ago, 1988 through 1989. And you rarely find it. I don't think I've ever come across another case like Lazar's where somebody had such an incredible story to tell, but did actually absolutely nothing with it. And as I said, I don't think that is the sign of a hoaxer. A hoaxer, it would be really going after the money and the dollars and the fame and the TV. Lazar was really very much in the shadows, even the early 90s when he was interviewed by people like Timothy Good, whose book Alien Liaison covers a lot of the Lazar story. But again, it was like, well, who do we believe? And I do believe Lazar did work out there. I do believe he saw these craft. I'm in two minds as to whether he actually saw alien spacecraft, or if he was like a patsy, if he was being used as a means to put a message out to someone like the Russians or the Chinese that we've got alien technology when maybe we haven't, or maybe we have. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In the late 1980s, we know this now from the Freedom of Information Act, that in the period sort of 84 to about 87, we know that there was sort of like a cabal of Russian spies in the United States trying to find information on the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter, which hadn't, at that time, they hadn't been officially acknowledged and nobody really had seen them. And the US was very worried about these Russian spies uncovering information on all of our top secret aircraft, which is understandable. But what happened from there was we had people like Lazar, being exposed to alien technology and so on. It makes me wonder if the story of the UFOs and the aliens at Area 51, I sometimes wonder if this was actually created, this scenario, to try and entice these Russian spies, almost like a dangling carrot, and have them try and find out what's going on in Area 51, and then our agents, could jump in and grab them. So in other words, we have that scenario, the idea of a program designed to make people think we got extraterrestrial technology, but as a means to try and reel in these Soviet spies and then arrest them. Now that is one scenario, but it would be, to work, it would have to be incredibly sophisticated, because Lazar said he saw 7 or 8 of these circular craft out at Area 51. So, in that sense, I think we can, if that is the scenario, we can look at it from the perspective that it was incredibly advanced. And I'm not sure even the government would have had the ability to go that far in terms of building and constructing so many of these craft just as a means to try and catch a few Russian spies. By Lazar's own admission, he said on several occasions that when he went out to Area 51 and then came back home to Las Vegas, he said that he couldn't remember what had happened. There was like an entire day would be gone, or 2 days would be just blocked out of his mind. And he came to suspect that there'd been some sort of mind manipulation or mind control on him. So that sort of begs the question, how can we sort of determine how accurate Lazar's memories are when certain portions of his memory have been wiped out? And that's not like a slur on Lazar. It's just a case of, if part of his memory is gone and somebody's been playing mind games with him, how do we actually know what the full picture is? So the unfortunate side of it is that 31 years after Lazar first started to talk about this, we're still asking the same questions that we were back in 1988 and 1989. And as I said, unlike a lot of people, I don't think he's a hoaxer. I think he was speaking genuine, but I'm just not sure what he saw, and I don't know how much can be relied in relation to when somebody's mind is messed around with. Either there really are UFOs and aliens at Area 51, or somebody wants us to think there are aliens and UFOs at Area 51. So that's sort of my background and my take on Area 51. Different people have different scenarios. Other people kind of, blend a few different aspects into the phenomenon as well. So, I wish I could give you sort of more of a black and white picture, where we can say this and we can say that for sure. But that's the big problem with the whole Area 51 story, is that everything about it is weird, strange, lies, disinformation, and truth, but we don't know which one actually falls into which category. And maybe there are some people in government who actually like that. They like the whole thing in a state of mystique, primarily because the more confusion there is, the less likelihood is that we're going to get the answers. Maybe somebody's deliberately making us chase our tail down there and then down there when we should be looking there. So the story's a fascinating one, and there really isn't anything else like Area 51, not just the facility, but also the history of it as well. And maybe one day that'll change, you know, and overnight, for whatever reason, the whole story will come out. And if that happens, you know, it'll be pretty amazing, I think, whatever the answer is. And just one last thing, and we can have a think about 10 minutes, questions or so. I've got a new book out right now, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, which you might find interesting because it actually digs further into that angle of government manipulation and creating lies and counterintelligence programs. But this one sort of deals with from the Russian perspective. I use the Freedom of Information a lot and got hold of a number of interesting files talking about how the Russians were spreading UFO propaganda. As bizarre as it sounds, in the 1950s, as just one of many examples in the book, the Russians were actually spreading rumors that in the early 1950s, with the Space Brothers and the contactees, that the so-called Space Brothers that were coming to visit us and so on, were communists. Now, that kind of sounds really strange today, that the Russians back then would try and convince the people of the United States that the aliens visiting us were communists and communism is really good. That was the message they were trying to get across. So again, what this demonstrates is that as well as real UFOs, you know, there's no doubt in my mind that there are real UFOs, like my dad's experience in the 50s. That's what got me interested. We know there's a real phenomenon, but what's also going on is the creation and the fabrication of bogus UFO stories to hide the true stories. So the whole thing becomes like very much a detective story and mirrors Area 51. We know something's going on. We're not fully sure what the full picture is, though, and that's what we need to try and strive to get. So in the 15 minutes or so, if anybody's got any questions, if you want to come up to the mic, we can have a little Q&A.
Yes, I was wondering what your take is on the Wilson leak and the core secrets documents that.
The what? Sorry.
The Wilson leak that Admiral Wilson. I don't know if you've seen it, but a conversation between Eric Davis and Admiral Wilson that we have. ET technology. Oh,
yeah. Well, yeah, this is sort of one of a number of stories where people have come forward claiming to have worked or still working on alien technology. Now, it sounds incredible, but I mean, these people themselves are credible, you know, and when you look into it, you know, you're seeing scenarios where there's no real reason or any gain from actually saying that. I mean, it's like with the Philip Corso story, who wrote The Day After Roswell in 1997. Colonel Corso was this elderly guy who claimed decades before, that he worked on technology found at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And there's a lot of problems with the Corso story, to say the least. But what's intriguing is that why did he even feel the need to write the book at 83 and he died at 84, not really getting anything out of it? You know, I mean, as a writer myself, you know, I can tell you for sure that if you write books on UFOs, you know, you're not going to be living in Hollywood Hills and driving a Ferrari. You know, people think that, but it's you know, it's not like that at all. And so for someone like Corso to say he worked on alien technology, again, it's like, where's the goal? You know, what's the reason? And I kind of apply that to that story as well. It's an interesting story. Some people say it's garbage, but then it's like, well, why even say the story in the first place? You know, so
it strictly calls for your speculation and opinion. But do you think that by coming out with what Bob Lazar came out with, that he actually saved his life?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Did by Lazar going public, did that sort of save his life? There's no doubt at all that when Lazar went public, he went public because he had fears and concerns that something might happen to him. You know, Area 51, middle of nowhere, flown out with aircraft with blacked out windows. That's basically, they got him out there. You know, if you're out there and you're worried something's going to happen to you, there may be no way back. And so that's why on the final day when he was supposed to go there, he actually didn't go because he was worried, you know, no one would see him again. And he also said that on one occasion, round about the same time, one of his tyres was shot out as well on his car. And now whether that was deliberate or it was a sign to warn him, you know, I mean, if you've got like a well-trained assassin, they're not going to miss. So maybe they deliberately fired at the tyre, not to kill him, but just to warn him. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, warnings work really well. Just sort of putting the seed of fear in the person's mind. So, yeah, I think whether it was required or not, I think he did feel he was in deep danger. Whether he was or not, I don't know, but I think just the thought in his mind made him think, you know, I need to go public, otherwise something's going to happen. So, yeah. All right, well, thanks everybody, and thank you. Thanks.